Our next speaker is Adam Gazzaley from the University of California, San Francisco. Technology meets neuroscience, a vision of the future of brain fitness. So, Adam.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. How we validate our approach is really intimately interwoven with the nature of our intervention. So I need to first frame this discussion with the interventions that we're developing, and importantly, why. I think we all can agree that this is an important global challenge, especially in the context of aging, enhancing cognition expressed globally, and generally what that is, but even for all populations, both those healthy and impaired. And we have some very fundamental challenges with our current approach, and I just want to step through those rapidly. The first is that we use very poor assessments in the real world. All the advances, such as in cognitive neuroscience and understanding the brain functionally, don't really cross over into the clinical domain. We often do not know exactly what is wrong with those patients when they present to us as physicians, but of course that doesn't prevent us from treating. The problem is that the incumbent system, using small molecules, which we have been trying to do for 50 years, really has not had a true major win yet. And the main problem is that they're just poorly targeted. For the most part, they're acting globally on neurotransmitter systems and not the underlying computational unit of the brain, which is the neural network. And so we have this challenge that we need to increase our doses to very high levels to get the effects we want, and then we get pretty much just as many side effects along with them. The other problem is that it's a non-personalized system. We base our prescriptive advice on large population data that almost completely ignore the individual differences of the participants in those studies. Practitioners, not the best in the world, but many treat a single pill as a holy grail and try to use it alone. And for something as complex as the human brain and the mind, this is unlikely to yield the result that we're looking for. At least we have not seen that yet. And then we have an open loop system. It's a long, sloppy, non-quantitative cycle between how we intervene and how we update that intervention based on its effects. And I'd say this is really just not good enough for 2017 to have these fundamental limitations. And while I am glad that my colleagues are pursuing more targeted molecular approaches, especially those acting on underlying pathology, we need to have another approach working in parallel that has these criteria. It needs to be targeted, personalized, multimodal, and closed loop. So how do we do that? Well, I live in San Francisco, and one of the ways that we think about that can help everything is technology. And this is a particularly important time to be thinking about technology and its role in improving cognition, especially in older adults, because I would say we're sort of at a phase shift moment now where we see the consumerization of things like virtual reality, augmented reality, motion capture, wearable physiological devices, and machine learning and other artificial intelligence algorithms. Most of this is really targeting entertainment and media and communication. But can these be tools to help improve our cognition? And I'd say that it is possible, really due to the very concepts that we've been talking about of reserve and resilience and harnessing our brain's inherent plasticity. I would say that the most powerful way to do this is through the creation of what we think of as closed-loop system. A closed-loop system is where you intervene in some way and record with as low latency as possible the impact of that intervention, and then use that data to refine the intervention, apply it again, record, refine, cycle over and over again, at each pass becoming more targeted and more personalized, which is really the opposite of how we treat our patients now, right? You take a pill, you go home, you subjectively monitor your effects. Months later, you report back, and we go up or down 5 milligrams, right? This is the art of medicine, and it's really just not good enough. So how do we build closed-loop systems? Well, in our group, we create video games. Now, video games, as we know, are a powerful source of behavioral change, and they are immersive and engaging, which is another asset. And this is a quick cartoon of how you build a closed-loop video game. So you're playing a game that's challenging you, and through the mechanics of gameplay, you can activate neural networks in a selective way. Right? That's how the brain works. We respond to challenge selectively. But while you're playing, performance metrics, how rapid you are, how accurate you are, could be recorded by the game in real time. And that could be used to shape the environment, essentially to scale the challenge appropriate to your abilities, not just on day one, but how they change over time. We can also give real-time performance feedback in terms of rewards, and every game developer knows that this is the most powerful way to create deep engagement and immersion in the activity, which I think is going to be shown convincingly to be critical for change. But then we could bring in this other technology we talked about, motion capture and physiological monitoring, which we could do with simple devices you could wear. This can allow the software to understand you in the moment in a deeper way than it can with just your performance metrics. And then tools like augmented and virtual reality can be used to create even more real-world, more engaging environments. We can wrap this all together with advances in machine learning and other AI approaches, and what we wind up with here is a truly integrated multimodal closed-loop system. And I think we'll see that this will be the future of at least running in parallel with our molecular medicines to improving cognition, including when they decline with aging. To make this a little less abstract, just one data slide. This all started for me, this approach, in 2008 when I asked the question if we could build a game that challenges multitasking in older adults, healthy older adults, with the hypothesis that other abilities, other cognitive control abilities that use similar overlapping neural mechanisms of prefrontal cortical networks might also improve. And so you play NeuroRacer by driving a virtual car in a 3D environment, doing two tasks at the same time, both tasks, driving and responding to these signs, becoming more difficult as you play the game. And we showed that cognitive ability as assessed through this game in terms of multitasking really is declined even in healthy 20-year-olds, but we show that there's a performance decrement across the lifespan, which we've seen with other types of cognitive control abilities. But even 1 month of playing this game in its multitasking version leads to an improvement in multitasking on the game that even exceeds that of younger adults in many cases, and sustains 6 months later without being repeated. But I think what was most importantly is that we confirmed the hypothesis and showed that working memory assessed with an entirely different task, as well as sustained attention, also improves significantly, as well as the neural mechanisms of prefrontal cortical engagement and network activity that predicts those transfer effects. So this is the beginning. We published it in 2013 in Nature, and I think the most important thing is not the particular game, but the methodology that you can work closely with another industry, in this case the video game professionals, to build something entirely unique, and then through careful experimental design, have a placebo-controlled approach, as well as transfer effects, looking at sustainability, neural measures to look at mechanism. That if we're ever going to move something that sits now in the entertainment world and technology where it's currently being applied into the domain of actually helping improve our function, this is the approach that we need to continue to advance. We've been doing that through the creation of a new center, which my lab has evolved into at UCSF, called Neuroscape, to really bridge tech, and I mean non-invasive consumer technology, with neuroscience, both neuroscience inspiration as well as neuroscience methodology. I view this as a two pillars approach, and if one is missing, I don't think that we'll be able to have the impact we're looking for. Both development and research need to be coupled together, and I'm not going to say much about this now. This is described in a paper of View in Neuron in 2016 in more detail, but they're both very complex approaches to develop the highest level interventions. You can't just take something off the shelf that's used for cognitive testing and assume that it will create the type of meaningful, sustainable changes that we're looking for. And likewise, you actually have to show that what you have developed really has that type of impact. So there's lots of details here that I'm happy to discuss with any of you, but this is at least an hour talk in itself, going through all these steps. Let's just briefly mention that over the last 3 years, we have been developing a host of new games. These are 6 new games, each targeting different aspects of cognition. 3 of them are now in longitudinal testing in healthy older adults. They each involve high levels of art, music, story, reward, usability, all designed to create the deep engagement that we think is going to be critical. They all involve closed-loop algorithms, as I described, to put pressure on these systems to lead to change. And they use different types of interfaces. So mobile, of course, is incredibly exciting due to its accessibility. We have a study in India right now on foster care children to improve their attention abilities using a meditation-inspired game. We use motion capture, the idea that you can get people moving in games and not just using their eyeballs and their fingers and their brains is really exciting, especially due to all the evidence of physical fitness and its benefit on cognition. We have games in virtual reality where you move on an omnidirectional treadmill to train spatial navigation in a three-dimensional way, and lots of other projects in virtual reality. And unfortunately, I won't have time to speak about these now, but we certainly do not want to continue to step in the footsteps of the pharmaceutical industry and building silos around each of these games. The future would involve what I would think of as neuro-CrossFit training, where you get a personalized approach across many of these based on your baseline performance. But then, of course, the biggest question is, how do we know if any of this works? And so in parallel to all the work we've been doing on development, each of these games takes a couple of years to build. We have been advancing the experimental design principles that you need to actually validate them. The first is, what can we do in real time? So this is a technology called the glass brain. It's actually my glass brain. It's an integration of MRI. You could see the blue cortical surface and the golden white matter. But overlaid on top of it, and with real-time visualization, is 64-channel wireless EEG with Fourier transformation and source localization and artifact correction and multivariate range of causality, all being performed within 200 milliseconds to create this dynamic visualization of what's going on in the brain during gameplay. The idea, this is just one example, is that you could record much richer data in real time, not just to close the loop to guide the game engine, but to also validate and understand what its impact is. So beyond real-time brain recording, we could also record autonomic responses, eye movements, facial expression, full body movements. So we could create a much richer data set of how a person is changing over time, and then, of course, to use that data in an actionable way to create the ideal environment to challenge them and to lead to these changes. But of course, that's not enough for validation. And so for years now, we've been going through the steps, the challenging steps of understanding what it takes to do full, double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trials using these video game approaches. We now feel that we're successful with at least the first pass of those, and we've begun. We have 5 longitudinal studies on older adults, 3 with new games that are ongoing right now. Our goals here are to really understand transfer outside of the domain of the gameplay itself, and of course sustainability of those effects. And so if you were going to participate in our studies, the goals are really, at our level, is to look for the mechanism and the heterogeneity, the individual differences. So I'd say in our study, we're not trying to validate where we would make prescriptive advice, but just to really get a signal that something is going on here that's worth pursuing to the next step. This is what our outcome measures look like. It's pretty grueling to be a participant in our study, even though you play fun games. You get a deep, deep dive beforehand. MRI, structural, functional, EEG, stress testing. We do blood work looking at telomere length, hormone levels, inflammatory markers, all before and after training, and then a pretty extensive amount of what we call multimodal biosensing, recording functionality during training itself. So this is part of the process. But the other part of the process is somewhat even more complicated. It's navigating that very delicate relationship between academics and industry. And I think this is critical if we're really going to create things that get into the real world and help people. And so I, over the last 5 years, have been working on this process. I co-founded a company, Gazzaley, with friends that worked at LucasArts that developed that first video game, NeuroRacer. I filed a patent behind the methodology of NeuroRacer that's owned by UCSF. And now Gazzaley has a license on that and has, over the last 4 years, developed one single game with a team of professionals from the industry called Evo, which is much better in every way, more closed loops, higher level of engagement and art and music and story, all those elements. And then in what is sort of a polarizing move, somewhat to my surprise, this game is not available. There's no marketing budget. You can't buy it. It's now going through multiple trials, both as a diagnostic and a therapeutic tool. So all these studies are ongoing right now. We've actually just, Achille just released a preliminary report showing that this could be a very valuable and almost shockingly surrogate of amyloid deposition in the brain of healthy older adults. But the study that's raised the most attention is now a phase 3 FDA pre-submitted trial to approve this game as a clinical indication to treat children with ADHD. That data is a 9-site trial. I think 4 more sites are coming on across the US. I'm not on any of these trials, and that's another important part of the process to allow your colleagues to then validate it. These studies are not to figure out mechanism and understand all the subtleties of individual differences, but to lead to prescribable, even reimbursable treatment. MCI and early Alzheimer's disease are the next focus of these type of games. And so I think it's an exciting period in time for us. We'll know whether or not by the end of this year we have the first non-drug treatment for ADHD and the first prescribable video game. And I think there is great potential for older adults, both healthy and those that are impaired and suffering from dementia. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Questions for Adam? Yes, please.
Hi, I was curious, what is your placebo intervention for testing these video games?
Great. I was hoping someone would ask me and save me 30 seconds of my talk. So the placebo is really complicated, obviously, because unlike a drug study where you don't know what you're taking, here you know that you're doing something. So how we create our placebos is through a multi-step process. The first thing we do is we have another game that we believe that participants will think is going to have a benefit on our outcome measures to the same degree as our targeted intervention. And then we do a full study, sometimes in person, sometimes using online tools like Mechanical Turk, to determine that the expectancy between individuals that match our control group is balanced between them, that people think that this crappy game that we think is not going to do anything and doesn't have active ingredients is going to lead to working memory improvement the same way as our meditation-inspired game is going to. So the first thing we do is balance expectations, which we think is the critical ingredient of being a placebo. This is a protected internal audience. We put on our website these other games and treat them just like they are our full-out interventions to protect the blinding. And then we go through a double blinding process that's quite complicated where the research associate never really knows what the person is playing, and so we keep switching our associates around in order to create the blinding process, which is also critical here to maintain the placebo characteristics. That's a bit of what we do. I'm happy to tell you more about it later.
Yes, please.
What do you think the common mechanisms are that would be affected in memory and aging and traumatic brain injury, ADHD? What's the magic bullet there?
Yeah, so what we think the magic bullet is cognitive control abilities. And that's why, and I didn't get into this at all of our games are targeting cognitive control, defined as a triad of attention, both selective and sustained, working memory, and then what we describe as goal management, multitasking and task switching. If you look across I would say every neurological or psychiatric disease that somehow impacts cognition, you will find deficits in all of those abilities. They're just very complicated, full brain network functions. And so our target is always to improve cognitive control because we think it's going to give us the best opportunity to get transfer outside of the domain of training and also has the best opportunity to help all these populations.
Carol?
Great talk, Adam. So, of course, I'm excited about your multitasking, switching between sort of sustained and flexible attention and how that does transfer. I'm just wondering if you've gotten so far as to see whether you can get, say, more medial temporal lobe function to interact with how you're sort of pumping up the frontal cortex. So this is a, as you are well aware, a really rich idea for us pursuing, how to understand the basic mechanisms of these kinds of functions, both temporal lobe and frontal, in our aging models. Can you say more about what you're targeting, and if you are just successful as training up temporal lobe as you are frontal?
Yeah, so we just started down that pathway. So we have our first project that is targeting medial temporal lobe function and more on long-term memory. Again, it's always in the context of cognitive control for us, because that's what you need to actually play a game in the first place. But our game it's called Labyrinth. It is in virtual reality. It uses this device called the Omni, which actually, I think we have the first one in the US. That's this omnidirectional treadmill. So our older participants, we're still in development, put on a headset, and they have to navigate an adaptive 3D maze that is changing the level of cues that they have, the complexity of the maze. Our hypothesis here is that since spatial navigation is such an ancient part of our memory systems, that this may be the way, if we train it in a rich enough environment. You also get a bit of physical exercise while you navigate, so we think that that would help increase the effects as well, that we will see improvements in memory function outside of the spatial navigation domain. But that's a hypothesis. We will run that study compared to the non-virtual reality version of it, as well as the version that has no physical fitness challenges. So we just started down that pathway.
I think we have time for one more, and then we'll go to the general discussion. In the back, please. Sorry.
Naftali.
Naftali, yeah.
Okay. So it's a great example of excellent talk and inspirational public speaking. Quick question. Do you have any data like numbers, tables, graphs? Because it makes me uncomfortable to see the whole fascinating program presented with no numbers or graphs or pictures or whatever.
I largely reserve those for the publications, because I think it's pretty boring to work through each figure. But so the publications we have so far are the Nature paper, and we have a paper in Neuron looking at another type of perceptual discrimination training. Other than that, we have a paper right now that's in review, 2 other papers, and now largely over the last 3 years we've been building all these tools. So the studies that we will be publishing are all the longitudinal trials that'll take probably another couple years to finish. But that's really our goal, obviously, is to try to generate as much data to make this convincing as possible. In my short time here today, I did want to be more on the inspirational side, because I view this as a new field, but we've already generated a good amount of data to support at least the direction that we're heading in, and that's what you'll be seeing over the coming years.
So this Nature paper, basically a cornerstone of the whole approach.
Well, I'd say that the Nature paper was our first foray into this type of study, but we've made a lot of methodological advances since then. The Neuron paper that we had the year after is a different approach, where we ran a parallel study in humans and in rats, and so we're able to show both physiological changes using EEG, as well as intracranial recording changes that have a sort of converging story across different species. In our studies now, we're going a lot deeper on the outcome measures, as you heard. So looking for structural changes in the brain now using MRI as outcome measures. We don't have any data on that, but we have, as I said, 5 studies that are using those outcome measures, as well as looking at other markers of stress and mood and the blood indicators of inflammation that we think is also part of what is going to be the plasticity of the system.
Okay. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
So now we have